Hello, and welcome to Stanley Studio Visits with Grant Wood Fellow Johnathan Payne. I'm Kimberly Dachik, Curator of Learning and Engagement. The Stanley's virtual programs this year are supported by a generous donation by Yvonne McCabe. We are recording tonight's visit, and it will be available on the Stanley's YouTube page. This event is closed captioned. You can turn on the captions by selecting View Subtitles under the More menu option. Tonight's program is informal. If at any point you'd like to ask a question, you can put it in chat or unmute yourself and ask Johnathan. Johnathan earned a BA in art from Rhodes College in 2012 and received his MFA in Painting and Printmaking from the Yale School of Art in 2018. In 2018, he also completed the museum leadership training programs at the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Studio Museum in Harlem. While at Yale, Johnathan co-curated exhibitions centering marginal identities and their art practices, including Publishing Camp, Queer Dissemination, 2017, Queering Space at Yale, 2016, and Black Joy, also 2016. His work has recently been shown at Deli Gallery, Spring Break Art Show, and Jenkins Junction projects, all in New York City, The Complex in Memphis, Tennessee, and Diane Rosenstein Gallery in Los Angeles. He is featured in New American Paintings, MFA Annual, number 135, and has been published in The Observer, Vice, and The New Yorker. Johnathan will show us some of his current work tonight, and we'll see its unconventional nature defies traditional categorical definitions of art. Thank you for being with us tonight, Johnathan.
Thank you all for coming. I'm wearing a mask. Dr. Fauci says to, so I just follow his lead. I just want to thank you all for coming to this event. I guess, like Kimberly said, it's really informal. Please feel free to ask me questions at any point. I actually, would prefer that. So, I'm just going to sort of give you all sort of a verbal speaking tour of my studio and what's kind of going on in here. So yeah, this is kind of like generally where well, I guess, where should I start? Maybe here. So let's see, where to begin? So I basically make these paintings. Starts with these drawings, these pattern drawings of, just gridded pattern. I kind of started to go about this process of making in early 2019. I don't know if some of you may not be familiar with my work at all, but I guess I'll just maybe start by just doing a pan around the room. You can kind of get a sense of what's in here.
Are those mostly cutouts?
So let me bring you back to the desk real quick. Yes and no. The material that I'm working with is shredded paper. So there is an element of cutting happening by way of the paper shredder machine. But in terms of how they're constructed, I'm actually collaging the strips on top of themselves and kind of thinking about how points intersect. So there are parts that go sort of over others and underneath. And there's kind of a logic to, for the most part, there's a logic to how I want things to overlap or undulate. I'm typically like right, when I know sort of what the unit is that I'm working on, the pattern of it, it's just a matter of connecting the dots, essentially. So there are piles of scrap material that I cut to make sure that the pattern is uniform. And so I showed you all the drawings in the beginning. Those drawings inform how I make these. The drawings are essentially a scaled, well, these are a scaled up version from the drawings. They're like 2 ratio. So it's a pretty calculated process, and it really begins with trying to articulate what the pattern is going to be through the form of drawing. That's not always how it worked. Like I've been working with paper shreds now for about 5 years, and initially the way I went about making pattern was really intuition oriented. I would just lay the material out on top of itself, like, and just sort of play around and move things. And when I felt like it was sort of worth building on, that's kind of what happened. But now I'm much more oriented in trying to define the patterns first.
How old is that stuff?
These 3 pages I showed you are from 2020. And then the first one I showed you, so these, like I said, are from like March of last year. The paintings for these are not with me, but there is documentation online. Yeah, maybe just to focus on this one, because this is the painting version of that, for the drawing. So yeah, so I'll make these units, right? And then I call them units because I'm usually making the same exact one depending on what the pattern is. So here, for example, this is one. The things in the studio, by the way, are kind of like, they're slightly in different stages of the process. So, these are all sort of well, this one is in the construction phase, I guess. It's the units are, I'm using blue tape to like sort of align them on their seams, right? So I have this desire to sort of, not sort of, but to definitively, I guess, create balance and harmony between, one unit to the other. It's all about sort of continuing this pathway of the line. Right. So from here, I'll get to here where I've constructed a singular object by connecting the units together. And usually how I do this is I just adhere them along the seams, and then I hand stitch to reinforce the seams.
What's the total size on that piece? I like that.
Let's see. about 37 inches high. This is so hard to do. I'll hold it a phone.
Did it just snap on your hand?
No, I'm just laughing. Yeah, if my computer camera was on, this would be so hilarious. It's about 63 inches wide.
3 by 5, roughly, a little bigger.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, like I was saying, I line up the units. This is one unit. This is another unit, and then I just embroider along that seam. I like having the thread as like an additional line weight and like line language to the actual paper. As you can see, there are some markings on the paper. These kind of help me orient the pattern, just making sure that points are aligned where they're supposed to. This one is particularly interesting just because there are a lot of units, tiles, etc. that break on themselves. So there are repeating ones, but they may be inverted upside down, or there may be some slight changes and variations to it. And then usually what I do is I like to sort of reinforce the outer edge of these with just more paper, which is slightly thicker. Very minute difference, but it just helps with like the structural integrity of the object. Sort of another way of thinking about ideas around inversions, you can very well see that there is one unit, one tile, that I just inverted on itself to sort of break the pattern and to, kind of offset it a little bit.
Jonathan, I'm inspired by this, and it feels a lot like a quilt, but you can turn it backwards or in any direction you want.
Yeah, that's a good. I know. I'm glad that came up for you. Quilts is something that I think about. I look at them. They are a point of reference for me. This work, I kind of came into making work like this after discovering like textile-based sculpture, sort of thinking about how to build something onto itself by a singular thread or material that accumulates over time. These are some drawings I've been doing recently. These are actually just color experiments that resulted in more clarified drawings, but there's maybe to that point around like quilting or sort of mapping. I think quilting is a form of mapping out pattern. There's a strong reliance on the grid in order to construct the patterns of quilts. So, I definitely think that is present. I don't really come from a, family background of quilting or, anything like that. I just, I'm really drawn to the tactile nature of those types of objects. Maybe I'll go.
Oh, sorry, I had another question.
Oh yeah, sure.
When you were doing, this is Brendan, by the way. This is really interesting seeing how this comes together and the pieces. I like the way you're going through the stages. And sorry if I'm interrupting, but with the color experiments that you're doing, what are you looking at on those experiments when you've got your sketch experiment? You're just looking at how they mash together, kind of?
Yeah, I would say that color is it's a combination of being um, like a mechanized process like everything else, but there's something about it that also is inherently intuitive based for me. So I'm thinking about what feels right, to be honest. I know that sounds really subjective, and arguably it is, but for example, these two drawings are the same pattern, but slight variations in color. And sometimes I'll just mark a color on top of another color, like here or here. I may like put a color beside one and try to, in my brain, figure out which of those two makes for a more dynamic color relationship with everything else. It really just has to feel like it's working for me.
Those are super pretty. Are you using color pencil at that point?
Yeah, I'm just using Prisma color pencil.
Yeah, I love those.
I really like, I mean, the final versions of these, I also don't have with me, but they, I'm using a straight edge, like a ruler, and sort of, they're much tighter. Some of these I do use a straight edge to draw some of these, but otherwise they're really much more expressive than how I typically draw. I have all of these. I have like more pages from these. But I really want to try to get to. Oh, that's a good page. That's a great page. This is an example of how I'm trying to finalize the pattern. So I believe this one is connected to that one. Sort of as it relates to coloring with the work. So I typically try to, I guess I've been working in two ways. One is generally speaking monochromatically with the paintings, and another is thinking about the line work as a way to compose the color similar to these drawings. Earlier this year, while in residency in Memphis, Tennessee at Costume Arts, I sort of started to embark on color mixing work. So these are some of the swatches that I made. They're not organized in any particular logic. I just didn't have enough time to relearn how to organize the color, but each swatch is a measurement of either primary cyan, yellow light, magenta, black, white, and I always do a 1-to-1 water to paint ratio, just because I find that I prefer to work with liquefied paint, partially, like more. I want it to be more liquid, and so yeah, I kind of I honestly kind of got started doing this color mixing work just because I felt like I wasn't in my own ability to just kind of mix freehand. I feel like I wasn't really getting as far into the work that I needed to. I felt like I just kind of was mixing the same colors over and over and kind of wasting paint. And so this kind of allowed me to sort of learn color mixing and engage in this process of being able to sort of understand how color is built through mixing. And it's kind of remarkable that you can achieve a spectrum of color cyan, yellow, and magenta. Quite literally, these are, you know, all the paints I really have. I just think it's funny, you know. I mean, like, I feel like I stressed a lot about like how to be a real painter or something, and you know, I feel like it took a long time for me to realize that painting is a world onto itself, that you can create your own, you create the structure by which you make logical decisions in the process of painting. So these are just 3 smaller sort of works to sort of show how paint sits on these. Once they've been primed multiple times, you know, with like gesso and whatnot, like the patina is built up enough to endure multiple passes of color. So, you know, in this one, for example, paint just kind of sits in these different pockets. I believe with this one, I painted it horizontally, so that's why we get these puddles and stuff. Also, there's some sanding stuff. Usually, I'm just trying to work through how to alter surface, and sometimes I manipulate it onto one singular object. Here's another one. It's hard to see on the phone, but it kind of has slightly like a semi-gloss surface. And this one actually is laminated. And so about 3 years ago, I started to use these patterns as stencils to make large paintings, like wall paintings, and then also just works on paper and canvas. And so what I would do is I would laminate them, because that would just sort of immediately create a protective patina which the paper wouldn't disintegrate during the process of painting. But I feel like I had this, well, I was having these conflicted feelings about all the plastic I was wasting by, you know, kind of cutting out the negative space. And I started collecting all these buckets of excess laminate. And it really became the impetus for me to think about how to go about the surface of these differently. So maybe this one is a good one to talk about. So this one is kind of at the point where, you know, it's ready to be colored. It actually has been, but several times, but I've just painted, I've just re-gessoed it because it just hasn't been working the way I wanted to yet. But also you can tell, so this one is, the units are offset from one another. They're not overlapping. And so it's you're able to sort of create these really nice chunky points of connection. You can better see the thread work as well. And so, you know, this would naturally line up with that, but it doesn't. And so you have to kind of follow it a bit more closely. But anyway, I just wanted to show you this sort of when these things do get primed. You know, I'm trying to, yeah, just create a chunky kind of surface, and I'm painting both sides of them. Right. So that kind of helps also build up the objecthood of it more. And yeah, so also, you know, with the lamination process, like the patterns had to be a certain type of looseness, because you can't cut a piece of plastic that small. So it really kind of created this limitation on how dense or how complex the actual objects, like pattern and materiality could be. So yeah, it allowed me to get from that type of looseness to a much more intricate pattern. Let's see, maybe, I don't know if y'all want to see my books. Yeah, I mean, I define myself as an abstractionist, and I, find influence in, yeah, mid-century abstractionists of color, obviously. Thomas, Norman Lewis, Howard Ewan Mandel is a really big influence of mine. Agnes Martin, of course. And yeah, I mean, I guess also, yeah, interspersed in muses, right? Like the Jim Crow, by Malcolm X, and I kind of got into thinking about a type of structural geometry or abstraction by way of like outreach work, doing like sort of some youth outreach work based on like social justice curriculum to middle and high school students. So I mean, I think I like, I mean, obviously my work, is autonomous in and of itself from the things that I'm thinking about alongside maybe social justice or structuralism as it relates to like our lived realities. But I do think about that and sort of think about the way that I'm trying to create these more holistic structures, in my practice. So yeah, this is the drawing version of that object.
Johnathan, when you're working with high school and middle school students, are you leading them through a collaborative project, or what shape does that work take on?
Yeah. So the middle and high school students, that was work I used to do, but when I did that work, mainly what I was doing was using experiential learning as a vehicle to teach middle and high school age students about topics like racial justice, environmental justice, economic justice, community-related issues in Memphis, Tennessee, which is where I was living and doing this work. And so it really was about the process of engaging in the activity with everyone and finding success and failure in working together. And then reflecting on your experience and then adding or applying that to your understanding or perception of a larger lived experience and the community that you're in. So there was this sense of you're obviously you're like engaging in yourself by doing it, but you're also working with other people, but you're also thinking about how something as it could be literally like try to hold the hula hoop up with one finger together without letting it fall. How does that relate to, say, inequity? And so it really like that work really challenged me to believe in like stretching and applying ideas to things in ways that are non-traditional. And sometimes my students didn't understand it. Sometimes they thought it was, corny. But like after a certain amount of repetition, they were able to understand the value of that process more. So I've been thinking about how that, when I started to embark on making more process-driven, formalist, abstract work, like how that youth outreach work informed the way I went about art production. I'm wondering what else I can share with you all.
Hey, Jonathan, it's Bryson. I have a question about, hi. I know your work used to involve comic books, sort of deconstructing them. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of like where that influence or that engagement has led you in your current practice?
Absolutely. It's so funny that you said that. I was literally looking at a pile of comic books in the studio and was like, maybe I should talk about this. So,
Perfect.
yeah, so the comic books came into my practice like years ago. I sort of, like when I was an undergrad, my dad had bought some from the thrift store for my nephew or something, and I had just found them around the house. I didn't really grow up reading comics, but I was interested in like the hypermasculinity of the comics at that time, and also thinking about them as like objects of repressed homoerotic desire, like how hypermuscular and like the superheroes are, or the way that bodies are oriented in space, and arms or legs are like flailing and flying in the air and stuff like that. And there's like this language that also is oriented around sound. But I honestly feel like the comics sort of became less, they became less symbolic around that sort of self-projected fantasy, and they really kind of became more about like their formal makeup. So their color became just really interesting to me, the way that the comics are organized as a sequential narrative, the way that they orient themselves on a grid. And so, they really just kind of became some of the first material that I decided to shred and use to, make collage abstractions. And there also is like this, I kind of specifically gravitated towards older comics just because the material of the page is newsprint. It's not the glossy paper that makes up, the comics of, the current era. And so I think like the shredding of the material also maybe allowed for a type of a sort of hiding of the datedness of them, and a kind of reorienting or recentering the color, or how the story is no longer discernible anymore, and it may be just about figuring out like, oh, this is a Superman comic, or oh, this is a Steel comic, and not so much about the story. But also, I've also used like comics as just like spreads. Like I may just like take a centerfold or like deconstruct it and then use the pages that are folded on top of each other to create the book as like background noise for like other paintings. And so the comic book just becomes sort of like, the content of the comic becomes like a wallpaper. So there's also sort of a decorative aspect to it too. But yeah, I think this is interesting to think about because I kind of, I've moved into a much more, formal direction, I guess, in my current work. Sort of thinking less about found color and trying to develop my language around color through the process of making and mixing my own. However, early comic book printing relied on CMYK, color mapping and filters, or like, I don't know if they're called filters, but like those sort of like those color transparency that you can layer on top of each other in order to understand where certain colors are. And, there is, my color mixing work kind of came out of this book, really, in the chapter on color, that they talk about how comic book coloring kind of works. And it really kind of, made me focus in on CMYK and trying to understand how to mix it. So I do kind of see the connection between that color work, my color work, and that of early comics, but it is broad, and I'm still trying to figure out what that means exactly. I don't necessarily think that I won't return to these. I mean, I feel like I'm still trying to understand my relationship to this material. If that answers your question.
It did, thank you.
Kimberly, if you want to like spotlight my computer instead of my phone, that's fine.
Yeah, I'll just switch it over now. So Jonathan, one thing that I've been thinking about as you've been talking is this tension between the plan, like the grid, the color mixing, the kind of exactitude in your process, but also the intuition that you put into it. Do you feel that there's a tension, or does it kind of come naturally to resolve itself?
I do feel like there's a tension for sure. I think it's a lot easier for me to come to the pattern, actually. Like, I find that my intuition is really active when I'm trying to create a new pattern. But there is a lot of tightness to the process, and so sometimes the process is just about doing the labor that it takes to make enough of the material to be able to create the substrate. And the coloring is also something I think it's in between. It's like I don't want the color to feel, I don't want to be exhausted by the process of the coloring, and I actually really enjoy that process when I've made those decisions and I know where things go. But there's also this feeling of not wanting to be too mechanical, not wanting to be too much like a machine. And I have yet to sort of find the balance between that and what I want the work to do. Yeah, because my process was really predicated on pretty intensely on intuition, and then grad school happens. And so now it's like I'm pulling at the what's blossoming in terms of like a reclamation of the intuition and a trust in the work being able to do what it needs to do. Thank you, Patrice.
As you're kind of looking at, as I'm looking at your grids and the kind of units you're working in, do you find yourself drawn to the same size units, or does it vary depending on the pattern that you're working out?
It varies, but most recently, a 12-inch by 12-inch square has been a really nice, yeah, just like a really nice unit dimension. Yeah, I guess I can hold it up, but like the way that, also depending on how big it is, I'm usually trying to work with like a 1.5 to 3 inch sort of gap in between lines along the outer edge. And, but I also like to create different size units just to sort of, yeah, switch it up and to, it kind of goes back to that question around the comment around quilting. You know, I've been thinking about, okay, like when I'm making a unit, I'm already kind of thinking about coloring stuff. Like maybe one of them is a solid color. Maybe it's like a checkerboard, or maybe it's like each individual line has a different color on it. But like somehow the dimensionality of the unit helps me think in different terms about what the resolve will entail. Yeah. I do have one that is like 8 inches by 8 inches, like one of the units, and it feels so delicate. It's like it's like adorable. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so cute. And then I think about like, okay, like how many does it take to make a whole, and then how long does it take for me to make them? It's like I was really quite like, it felt really speedy and expeditious to work smaller. Yeah.
Hey, Jonathan. Laurel.
Hey, Laurel.
Hey, thanks. Actually, it's nice to see your studio, not having seen it for this whole time. I was going to ask you, just it's been great listening to you. And in terms of like the way you're building your structures, or I mean, in a sense, I also was going to ask you how you think about it, because basically you're restructuring it. You know, you're restructuring the things that you've decided to shred, you know, whether it's just plain paper or whether it's, you know, material that had content. But I noticed that some of like the drawings had a sort of symmetrical, ended up being symmetrical, and then some were asymmetrical. And just like that relationship, like how you think about, you know, asymmetry and symmetry, even in terms of what you were talking about before of kind of lived experience. And you know, I mean, I suppose you could think about it as a conflict, but it's just coexisting. I mean, you know, and things are obviously asymmetrical in the world and also symmetrical. And I just wondered, like the one right behind you, the smaller black cutout, and also the white one. Yeah, like there's this kind of wonderful, it's almost symmetrical, but it's a little off. And that's what makes it, I think, super interesting. And the big one too, you know, you think like you're looking at it and you think, oh, is it symmetrical? But then it goes off. And, you know, in a way that's like maybe the human element in it, or, you know, the intuitive element that isn't about measuration. Like, I wonder, like, how do you think about all those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think about, yeah, I think about all those things quite often. You know, I feel, I like the moments of rupture in the work. Sometimes, you know, you may sort of align, you know, the units together, and there's just like a tiny little hair of offness. It may just be like as simple as like one 1/8 of an inch or like 1/16 of an inch. And I just, there's something about that that's really satisfying, realizing that like I'm not going to be perfect when it comes to the construction of these objects. But in the case of this one, it was really satisfying to see it fully constructed, and to have that offset, to have that type of rhythm with, with the edges of the object. Like it's just like, oh, it's so nice when that happens.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I get that. Yeah. Yeah.
But also I've used, as I said earlier, like I've used some of these. At one point, I used to call these things constructions, and so they had this sort of name to them. I'm uncertain about my relationship to that word now with regards to these, but these also can be used in other ways. Like it also is a tool, essentially.
Yeah.
In my head, I was thinking, oh, maybe I'll do like a stencil demo. I was like, no, we're gonna squash that idea, but it would be cool. Like ultimately, the offset comes from stenciling and comes from like thinking about, right, like a different type of process, essentially. And yeah, I was thinking about, what was I thinking about? So many things, I think too much, but just kind of like the inherent contradiction of a grid. Like it is by definition a contradiction. You have a perpendicular meeting a parallel, and but that creates balance and harmony. And I think that there is something kind of there's something super hyper idyllic about grids and about lattices. And I often find a lot of reprieve and a sense of comfort in the fact that like I do have control over, for the most part, I have quite a lot of control over this process, but that is not necessarily the case with life or with circumstances. And so I'm kind of drawn to the way that the art functions in a capacity beyond my experience or limitations.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I love that idea of, just that the kind of like safety of being able to, have some kind of control of, what we all know is a really chaotic existence, but also, appreciating just that little bit of like, every time it goes off a little bit, it's like a freedom, and so it's that balance of like freedom and control and safety and, everything. So, I think it's very human in that way. And also on some level, I think it's so available just visually to so many people everywhere, because I think we all have that idea of like that pattern recognition and, like all those neurological things that we as humans, it's the way we function. So I feel like there's recognition, like people would have recognition looking at those things, even though consciously they may not understand, they're going to feel it. At least that's what I think. But so I like the way you were talking about it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for taking all this time to walk through your process and share ideas about your works in progress and share all of those sketches and things. I think that's a really awesome thing for us to see that we usually don't get to see. We just see the final works. So thank you for opening up your studio to us and sharing that. And thank you everybody who came tonight and who asked questions and participated. It made it a really rich experience and discussion. And we'll see Jonathan and all the Grant Wood Fellows again in the spring for a more formal lecture and hear more about what's happening. So thank you, everybody.